So I was actually going to ask you to clap then, because you're British. I thought make Paul feel at home. The audience is clapping all the time, but that was spontaneous. But I actually wanted to start with a sort of slightly Little Englander question, actually. This may be how it comes across. And I don't know whether, Paul, you now think of yourself as an American or a Brit, so you can answer it how you wish. But I'm interested, as I think people will be, the Brits in Hollywood, you know, in the networks, showrunners, producers. Is there a kind of pattern? Is there a sort of difference that the Brits bring over there, or is that just me sort of being over romantic about the Brits?
No, it's good. I mean, first of all, I'm totally a Brit, and it's clear every time I walk into a room in America, everybody comments on it. Nobody understands a word I'm saying. It's sort of, I take it with me everywhere I go. That being said, traditionally in Hollywood, what's been interesting is over the last 30 years. Brits have driven as talent, as on-screen, as behind the camera. And, you know, we were all brought up on Monty Python and the Beatles. We were brought up to think irreverently and differently. And that's been a sort of superpower. But traditionally, you don't get Brits in corporate roles. Howard Stringer famously ran CBS for a little bit. Peter Rice works. But there are a few of them. And that's partly because American companies are such incredibly ritualized, difficult institutions. You almost have to be an anthropologist to figure out exactly how to get through a meeting.
Your experience at the BBC may have been helpful in this regard.
Yeah, exactly. But I worked on Brazilian soap operas beforehand, so it's like a classic route. Yeah. Arena on BBC Two, Brazilian 7 o'clock soap operas, which was the real crap soap operas. Anybody was on the 8 o'clock. But there's no question that American television, I've got many of my execs at the back of the room here, American pitches are like 17th century France. I mean, you sit in a certain place and, you know, it's like the levee of the king. So you come in at a certain time. If the small talk lasts 3 minutes and not 5, it's a problem. You know, if you want to pass on something, you know, we were, I shouldn't say this, we were just on a call. We were essentially going to pass on the project. The 5 people listening to the call went, but you were so nice about it. You're like, no, that's part of the ritual.
So and that's how it works.
It's hard to, what I would say on it is, it's often a disadvantage. Like, people can look at you and go, this is a total scam. How does a Brit, you know, understand what middle America is going to watch? And there's truth to that. But I also think it's a bit of a superpower because, or at least it's a secret weapon. In as much as when people look at you and say, look, fairy tales are never going to work on television. You know, or you cannot have a lead of a broadcast drama who's an African-American or something. As an outsider, you can go, well, look, why not? I'm not going to live by those rules. And you're just going to follow your gut and do whatever is going to move you to laughter and tears. And I think if you're lucky, you can use that to your advantage, if you're lucky.
Right. And so it's not just Brazilian soap operas. Obviously, it's BBC America you launched. It's ABC Family. So there's a bit more to it, and you arrive at some point in 2010 as you know, running the ABC network. Is there a moment then when you're thinking, right, here's the plan? You know, you arrive, you think, this is what I'm inheriting, this is what I need to do with it. Does that develop over time? How does that work?
I do think, look, there's a huge amount of luck in any television, and there's no question that to get any show to work is immensely difficult. You know, you've got to be lucky with the timing. You've got to, you know, you're picking from thousands of pitches and 70 scripts and 10 pilots, and then the launch has to be great, and the marketing has to be right, and the pilot has to be good in the first half of the series. So your statistical chances of making it work are so difficult, there's no question there's a lot of luck involved. But that being said, I definitely learned as I went up through BBC America and ABC Family that you've got to get a very clear idea of what your network is and what you're trying to deliver to. I was to some degree it was hard when we all started because we were losing some of the big shows, from Lost to Desperate, and it looked like we were going to lose Grey's. And it was very hard to then turn a network around as you were losing those big players. But that being said, there was a kernel of truth there. We'd been lucky enough to inherit Modern Family. We had Grey's Anatomy. Both of those shows were incredibly sophisticated, upscale, and this for a broadcast network, and very emotional shows. And, you know, sometimes, certainly with BBC America, we'd always run away from emotion. Any comedy that everybody loved each other and kissed at the end was always a disaster. They all had to hate each other. But on a big American network, that notion of what we define smart with heart was a sort of brand prism that became defining. And if you look at our Wednesday night and our Thursday nights, Each one of those are sophisticated emotional entertainment. So that was the first prism, which is what is your brand? The second insight we had has really come to play, and it took time to get there, which was CBS was clearly the dominant network in the US throughout the previous decade. And they'd done extremely well with the crime procedurals that I think everybody knows. And that's sort of what we call least objectionable television. In other words, they're fantastically well made, but it's television that you're going to watch with the family if you're surfing through a group of channels. Well, what we, I think, all realized, I think everybody in this room 4 or 5 years ago, is, you know what, you're going to watch whatever you want to watch and wherever you want to watch it. So now what's going to drive it is passion. It's really got to be great. You've got to find the strongest voices and the most distinctive voices, and also the most diverse voices, and they, on their own, will bring their own fan bases to bear. And so our success is being built much more, and we can go through this, on the voices of the network, than the notion of least objectionable television. It took some time, but I do think the world's come in that direction, and it's one of the reasons why the shows are working.
Well, so let's do that. So let's sort of come to present day.
Do you think if I open this, it'll explode on us?
I don't know whether you should try that.
Oh, yeah.
It's been okay, yeah. It's The Guardian, so don't have too much,
because it's vodka.
It's resources are not thick on the ground. So let's come to present day. And things are, and we'll go into sort of what success means for a network now, because I think some interesting things around that with some of the competitors you've got and the over-the-top providers and so on. But before we get very British and negative and question the success, which
maybe we'll never get
very
that.
comfortable
maybe
doing.
we go to questions before we get British.
We have to be very un-British and say, annoyingly, it seems to be going very well, and you're having a good time. So can we just look at what a couple, some of the constituent parts are that give that making things, as I say, go well for ABC, and I can maybe even guide you, because I think people are very interested in a couple of shows we saw out there. One is Blackish, and which is a comedy, and getting comedies to work obviously immensely challenging. So we're interested to hear about that. And the other, How to Get Away with Murder, which is a Shonda show, which will but feel free to pick anything you wish.
Well, the first thing to point out about those two shows, which is a strategy that you don't see when you're watching the network, but was deeply important to us, particularly in a world that was fragmenting, is that they're both owned shows. So we run both the network and the studio, and there was a very, very concerted effort to say, you know what, we have this magnificent platform. We are going to sell our shows to many other, and that's not so important when you're selling in the UK and around the world, but it will attract more talent to our studio to say, we're going to sell our shows to CBS, to our cable competitors, but we're also going to use the network to launch some amazing new shows ourselves and to own those shows. These broadcast networks 20 or 30 years ago, the boss of the Walt Disney Company is Bob Iger. When he did my job, you weren't even allowed to own a show. Now the long game is owning shows, and so we use the platform of broadcast to make sure that we do that. And our Wednesday and Thursday nights are really peopled by shows that are our own. But to dig a little bit deeper, I mean, on Thursday night, we have this TGIT block, which we talked about, and we went counter to what you would have thought. It's a counterintuitive idea to say, you know what, in a world where people can watch wherever they want to watch, we're going to create an event out of scripted programming. We're going to create a night of television that is actually driven by social. And so what Shonda's done, Grey's Anatomy, I think you guys know well, Scandal is really firing on all cylinders. I think it's the #1 drama in America at the moment. We launched this new show with Viola Davis called How to Get Away with Murder. That's written by Pete Norwalk, who comes out of the Shondaland world, and she's mentored up to that. Each one of those 3 shows is full of cliffhangers. It's full of events. It's full of jaw-dropping moments. And so the branding of the night was, and this is part of our branding, TGIT is branded with the red wine and the popcorn that all our audiences sit and watch, and they cannot get enough of that night. And the thing is, it explodes all over Facebook, all over Twitter, and
once
makes
the wine starts flowing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm a bit like that.
We actually have ownership in the wine too, because that's a Kliego. But that ability to use buzz and to use Twitter and Facebook to drive audiences back to the network has been tremendously successful. So there you are with actually a fairly traditional idea, which is lead in, but using it in a way that's deeply social. And on our Wednesday nights, Wednesday's particularly interesting because I don't know if you guys know the sort of ins and outs of this season, but our competitors are having a lot of problems launching comedy at the moment. which is interesting because you'd expect at this point for comedy to really be on the rise again. But drama really is dominating on most of our competitors. And Wednesday night is a real beacon of great comedy because we have Middle, followed by the Goldbergs, followed by Modern Family, followed by Blackish. They're all single camera. They're all driven by incredibly distinctive, specific voices. Most of them is incredibly personal. I mean, I forced Adam Goldberg to call his show The Goldbergs. Thank God it worked, because he was like terrified it would destroy him and his family forever. But, and each one of those shows are very distinctive, different groups. I mean, the Middle is what Americans call a blue-collar family. Modern is a very diverse family, you know, led in many ways by gay marriage at the heart of it. At least that's one of the key legs of that. And Blackish leans into race in a way that has not traditionally been done on broadcast television, although clearly the Crosby Show is as an example of an African-American show that's done well. So they're all very specific, but they're all very, very emotional and very sophisticated. And again, they provide a flow that's worked. So something very traditional has worked for us, and that's lead.
And I want to come back to Shonda in just a second, because just to get a bit more flavour there, and because some people may be aware of who she is, and some not. So, but just picking up on something you said, you'll be aware, I think, of the sort of debates about diversity in the UK.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that ABC, you know, you've taken a lead in that, both in terms of the subjects, the way you cover some of those subjects in your shows, and I think in terms of showrunners and behind the camera. So I guess the question would be, do you see a clear link between people behind the camera and the subjects covered on screen? Is that the kind of key?
I think that's the absolute key. I mean, to some degree, this has been something we've been doing for a very long time, and you have a lot of diversity on our network. I think we have Kelly Lee here. Is Kelly here? Kelly Lee's here. She was up in Edinburgh talking about this. She's our head of casting. And we really drive this through when you look at the faces of the network. But what we did differently this year, and you know what? We did it to make the best shows. We didn't do it because we thought we needed to fulfill a mandate or because we wanted to look good. Or we did it because, number one, the audiences in America are dramatically shifting. The Latino audiences are growing. The African-American audiences have always been powerful. And it is our job to reflect America. And if we're going to be a relevant network, we're going to need to reflect America and look like America. The interesting thing about Wednesday night is each one of those different shows is a completely different group, but you relate to each one of them. So of those four, right, you know, only one of them is actually a documentary of my life. It's actually Goldberg's, but the other ones are deeply relatable. So anybody, we have huge white audiences for Blackish, we have huge straight audiences for Modern Family, we have huge aspirational audiences for Middle. So we've got very specific shows that are relatable to all of America. But your point's the key one. What we did this year is we said, you know what? We're going to go to the most distinctive, strongest, most passionate voices, and we're going to let them sing. We're going to give them the air support. We're going to give them the protection, and we're going to let them tell their stories. So there are two shows that haven't yet launched. There's one by John Ridley called American Crime. Right. You guys should watch it. John Ridley is the guy who did 12 Years a Slave. It's an extraordinary piece of television, incredibly powerful. Comes out of our studio. And it's only from the mind of John Ridley. And we effectively went, you know what, make it. We'll leave you free to make it, go make it. We trust in your vision and your voice. The network, but not the studio, has a show called Fresh Off the Boat, which is done by a fantastic showrunner called Anoushka Khan. It's a brilliant Asian comedy. Of course, Blackish is written by a guy called Kenya Barris. It's his personal life and viewpoint. What's happened in America is since Friends, we compete against other networks, and we compete in a very, very controlled time. So there we are against sometimes 80, 90, 100, 120 other pilots being made, and everybody's trying to cast for the 28-year-old good-looking new Friends cast. And it's been fascinating to see, not just from the showrunner perspective, but how we can unleash new talent, I mean on-screen talent as well as behind, by bringing new voices and new type of faces to the network. So we only picked up those pilots because they were the best. Right. I mean, I've got everybody at the back in the room who was in those pilot screenings. And we didn't sit there and say, let's pick up the diverse pilots. We said, let's pick up the best pilots. And here's the thing, those strong voices with those new attacks on comedy or drama are the ones that were the best. And it's worked. You know, the taboo that you cannot have an ethnically diverse group of people on a network or an ethnically diverse set of showrunners has certainly been proven, at least for this season, not to be true. I'm showing off too much. I've been in America too much.
No,
I'll take that back. I'm not a Brit. I'm an American now.
As I said to you earlier, no one's going to criticise you to your face in here. It's Britain.
That's great. So just wait till we finish.
You're fine. No. And then Twitter will be set alight. Don't worry.
Oh yeah, I forgot about Twitter.
But just as I said, just thinking about Shonda Rhimes for a second.
Did I fail to answer your question?
No, we're not going to talk about that because we're moving on in my head. I'm editing out loud, not a good look, but what I was thinking, Blackish, which we've talked about, and maybe just give a top line or two about what that, people, I don't know if everyone's aware of what that show is, but as I said earlier, what's interesting about that is it's a breakout comedy, and everything's tough in this business, but having a comedy breakout would seem, at the moment, to be perhaps the toughest job of all. So what do you think, what is it about that show, you think, that's speaking to people?
Well, first of all, it's just brilliantly written and brilliantly done. It is the story of Kenya Barris, who wrote it, is really telling his own story. And his own story is that he's looking at the three generations of his family. He's looking at his kids who are completely colorblind. Himself, who's trying to find a way to be less racially aware than he used to be, and his dad, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, who's his dad. So you can imagine what that third generation is thinking about. And so they play out this issue of identity, of who I am, of how I fit. It's particularly relevant in an American world where everybody has a specific identity but is fitting into a wider whole. But I think it's true of every culture. And that question of who I am, how black I am, is brilliantly done. I mean, there's one episode where the kid doesn't nod at this other kid who goes past him, who happens to be black. And the dad's like, why didn't you nod to him? He's like, well, I don't know him. But you're supposed to nod to him. Was there something wrong with your neck? And that notion of how the different generations play that is fascinating. It's not just about race. The millennial audience, and I used to run a network called ABC Family when we were targeted the millennial audience, is just a hell of a lot more colorblind than the two audiences that go before it. And that plays to our strengths because it brings in new audiences for us.
It's a great show. So just thinking about, as we said earlier, success. So there's lots of good things happening. But what does success, how do you define success these days? And without painting too bleak a picture, I think the pressure on US networks, as indeed broadcasters around the world, is immense. You've got the over-the-top providers, the Netflix, Hulus and so on. You've got digital disruption. I won't go on too much. But everyone in this room is aware of what those issues are. How do you define what success is? And is it, in the end, about managing a decline, right, over time? Is that how it feels, or how do you look at it?
First of all, here's the fascinating thing. We did a study of how many people watched Grey's and Desperate Housewives 10 years ago, and how many people are watching our new hits. And it turns out, of course, many less people are watching in a linear, live, same-day environment on the network. You're looking at completely different ratings 10 years later. But actually, we have more of the same amount of people who watch those shows. We have actually more cultural impact in some ways. I don't want to overclaim that because Desperate was a massive hit when it came out the door, but it's easier to have a quicker cultural impact because of the ability on Facebook and Twitter to have that conversation explode live while you're watching that show. So one of the core issues here is not that less people are watching. We have more and more platforms that people can watch on. It's that we don't necessarily monetize or measure every single view that sits there. So there are issues in measurement, and we are pressuring as hard as we can to make sure that everybody who watches How to Get Away with Murder, and here's a show that's a huge rating on the network for us that grows 60-70% in Live 3. You use L3 and L7 in right. The UK. So over the first 7 days, it nearly doubles in size. And yet even that is a fraction of the audience because we stream online and yet we don't pick up those particular ratings. And then there are other platforms that go beyond it. So the amount of viewership overall is stable and in some ways growing. But you're absolutely right. You have these new disruptors who are coming into play. And there's no question that you are looking, and we've been looking in the last 10 years, and we will look for the next 10 years, at a world that's very much in transition. And you have players, some of whom are both a threat and an opportunity at the same time. You give you an example of the opportunity, and we can talk about threats in a second. The SVOD players that have come in, the Hulus, which we own a part of and we're aggressive in launching early, and the Netflixes and the Amazons, when we started on this job 4 or 5 years ago, it was very, very difficult to have a long-term back-end value for serialized shows. There was abroad, of course, a lot of interest in that, but we literally couldn't sell them to cable. And cable was paying huge amounts of money for the procedurals, for the crime shows that sat there. Well, repeats have become less and less and less valuable now on cable. So cable is pushing hard, and you guys, who are production entities and who are selling, are seeing more and more buyers who want more and more originals. And that's another issue, is do you have, in the end, too many originals out there? But it means that the pressure on those shows are going downwards, but the pressure on serialized shows is now heated, because that binge viewing that goes on SVOD platforms not only drives up our ability as a studio to sell those shows and really monetize them, they become incredibly valuable shows, but here's the interesting thing, it actually drives people back to the network. So Scandal, as a for instance, we launched that 5 years ago? It didn't launch that well. And yet it caught on. About episode 6 or 7, nobody still had noticed it, but the show was brilliant. Shonda, who we talked about a few times, it just nailed it. We then binged, we gave the opportunity on SVOD platforms for people to binge view that over the summer. And they came back in the second season. And then they came back beyond that. In fact, all of us have the ability now to get into serialized shows and soaps, which we've redefined for primetime, and do so in a way that you would have gone, you know what, I haven't seen the beginning of Revenge, there's no point in me wasting the time, I don't really understand what's there. So in terms of shows themselves, there's no question that that's an opportunity. In terms of a new and disruptive set of technologies, Disney itself is always driving aggressively into those areas. We drove into the iTunes television, we drove into streaming before anybody else. It's a very sort of technologically focused company. That's why we got in so early in Hulu, and we will continue to drive into that space. But here's what I would say on that front. In any market, in any disruption, in any transitions, the things that will survive are two things. One, the strongest brands, and two, the strongest shows. And I think Disney is one of the reasons I really wanted to work for them, and I love working there. When you look at Disney Channel, you know, tremendously strong brand driven by originals, and ABC Family, and our sister networks over at A&E, but ABC as well. Let alone Lucas and Disney, and the Disney features, and Pixar, and Marvel. You're looking at tremendously strong brand with real emotional connections with different audiences. The Marvel connection is more with a male audience. The ABC connection is male inclusive, but it's with a female audience, an upscale 18 to 49 audience. And so as you go through, and if you've watched the last 30 years, you always see this happening. Those networks and those shows that have strong relationships with the audiences are going to be able to ride this wave stronger. So I do think Disney's well positioned for that.
But is one of the things that you think from a creative perspective when you look at, you know, House of Cards over at Netflix, you look at the big cable shows, you know, Walking Dead and so on, do you question, or do you have a different view on what therefore is a network show? What is now, you know, the essential DNA of a network show? Is it fewer and bigger? Is it about the talent? Is it about what does it feel like to you? You
know, I think those distinctions are getting lower and lower. I really do. I mean, I wouldn't sit here and say that I don't think that House of Cards or Homeland could have worked on us. And when you look at, you know, the audience's responses to our Thursday night or even our Wednesday nights, let alone shows like American Crime, I think in the end we're in a world, and I love this world, where the very best rises to the top and where good isn't good enough. And so, you know, we definitely in broadcast live under some legal restrictions that come from the FCC that don't allow us to use certain words, and there's more limitations on violence, for instance, that pay cable can do, like HBO and Showtime. But if you look at the great television that's out there, it's incredibly difficult to say that it lands on a platform. In other words, look at the SVOD players, you have House of Cards, you look at the pay players, you know, and you have Game of Thrones, you look at the basic cable players, you know, and you have Walking Dead, and you have Breaking Bad, and you look at the broadcast players, you know, you have shows like How to Get Away with Murder and Blackish and Modern Family. I just slipped in my own shows there.
Yeah, I noticed that. Any others you like from other?
Yeah, that's it. But in other words, there's a reason why you're in a world where the best rises to the top, and I truly think that's platform agnostic.
So it's always good to have 40 minutes to cover the biggest TV market in the world, and I'm conscious of time, so we're going to keep jumping around for a little bit,
okay.
Paul. So I wanted to touch on non-scripted or non-scripted programming.
Yeah.
Because I think there's no question it feels like a terribly exciting time for scripted. There's all sorts of interesting things happening in that space. You and I know, and everyone in this room knows, that there is going to be another massive global non-scripted hit, right? We know that's going to happen. We don't know where it is or what it is, but it's going to... But is there a feeling right now...
Do you run a non-scripted empire by any chance?
Yeah, I have 25% of what we do is scripted, so I'm pretty relaxed. Do you feel... Is there a growing lack of confidence in non-scripted, or are the broadcasters feeling it's getting harder to do that? And perhaps we could look at Rising Star, which was a
that was one of ours,
big show with a lot of expectations. Didn't... Well, you tell us, but didn't for whatever reason didn't work. What was that about? What did you learn about that? And does it speak to something broader?
Well, to your first point, I absolutely don't think there's a lack of confidence in reality. In fact, quite the opposite. Reality drives so many of the networks, and we are due another big one, or due another big one. Excuse my language.
Exciting. Feels like we're over in America. Say do.
I know.
Much more. It takes us away from Hammersmith. It's lovely.
I'm somehow stuck in the middle of the Atlantic and unacceptable on both continents. But first of all, there's no question that there's a very interesting question raised now about the longevity of some of these franchises. In other words, I don't think anybody would have predicted 10 years ago that dancing would still be white hot and that Bachelor, would be an incredibly fresh, interesting, young, talked about show. And I think there's a huge amount of work that goes into the number of the networks to make sure that that's the case. That's clearly not the case on some X Factor, but it is definitely the case for some franchises. And so, the way that you tend these reality franchises and refresh them, I think is becoming more and more important. That's the first case. Secondly, you certainly haven't seen, since I got into the network, something that launched huge and stayed big. But you have seen a number of franchises. The one on our network that I'm thinking about is Shark Tank, that start and quietly get an audience and build quietly. It's a little bit more like a comedy building because you've got a family there and they're all bickering but eventually you get to the maybe Gogglebox is something like that. You get to the point where the audience falls in love. It's their family. They love the conflict. They love the laughter, and they're given what they can get from a great sitcom. And Shark Tank's now become a huge franchise for us. So the ability to build reality franchises is important. But that being said, every time somebody announces the death of a particular genre is the moment where it's ripe for a return. And there are plenty of areas that have not been plowed recently that are ready to return. I mean, Variety in America hasn't been there for a very, very long time.
Privately, actually, I don't think they need to know what the areas are. There we go. So, what do you think? Actually, you haven't said a lot about Rising Star, no, but not most shows don't work, right? So it's not about that. I'm just interested whether there was anything particular about that show you sort of take away and think, was it about live voting? Was it,
it was, I really loved the live voting that we did with it. And I think it's going to be transformative. I think you're going to see a number of players coming in. That app worked extremely well. And the thing I would say about it was incredibly easy and simple. Literally, you just downloaded and you voted up and you voted down. And we gained a lot of data with it. We had like millions of people who downloaded it, and that was very successful. I think that'll be a good tool going forward. It did not prove to be as much of a tool or a draw for an audience as the twist of the chairs that sat there. Right. And I think people felt, it was some years later, and you'd been through X Factor, and you'd been through Voice, that they weren't ready for that one again. But it's always very difficult to define why things work and why they don't. It was a good show, though, and we were proud of it.
And I cut you off there saying, what obviously everyone does want to hear, which is sort of what are the, this is always a very difficult question, but what are the areas you think that aren't well served? What are the areas that you think actually would be interesting to hear from a show in this area, that area? What should people be bearing in mind if they want to pitch you immediately after this session, which I'm sure you'll be delighted to.
Well, the great thing is I have a number of the heads of my departments up there, so those are the guys to pitch up in the corner there.
Don't go anywhere.
It's difficult to tell. Certainly within the brand prism that we sit, a number of things are clear we can talk about scripted and reality. Yeah. From a scripted perspective, we're looking for extraordinary and powerful voices. We certainly want an emotional core to what we do. That's what distinguishes us. ABC is a much more emotional network. We certainly look for flawed characters, but we look for an emotional core. We also look for something that is different, that you've never seen before. One of the really fun things about ABC, which is what makes Channing and Patrick's job super fun to do, is that we get paid back when we take risks. There are networks out there, where you really have to keep making what Americans call the cookie cutter. You have to keep delivering on a simple promise. But the truth is, you put Once Upon a Time on television, people tell you that won't work, and it does. Or you put How to Get Away on television, and they say it won't work, and it will. So we look for things that break the rules. It's one of our brand attributes. We do make aspirational television, but anybody who's a strong voice, I go from Ridley to Shonda Rhimes to Chris and Steve Levitan and Lloyd, who run Modern Family, to Kenya. Anyone who's got an incredibly distinctive voice, we're going to be very, very interested in. In reality, we've seen a number of the waves of reality that went through cable and got to, I was part of a lot of this when I was at BBC America and inside the Discovery Group, and you saw the makeover wave go through, and we saw, the game show waves go through. The one wave that didn't yet get to broadcast is docusoap, and I'm sure there is a way to do docusoaps on a big broadcast television. We haven't seen Variety recently. So there are a number of different areas that we're looking for, but some of them are just brilliant little ideas that we're going to probably seed over the summer and let grow like Shark Tank rather than launch big. The other thing I would say is we live in a very, very fragmented and competitive world. There are hundreds of other shows out there and hundreds of competitors. And so for a show to really break out, it needs to be marketable, and you need to market it well. That may be by casting, that may be by idea, that may be by hook, or that may just be by brand, that it fits our brand. But a show that is uncastable, that is unmarketable, is becoming increasingly difficult to succeed, by the way, on any platform. So that marketing hook, less important 10 years ago, the lead-in was everything, has become incredibly important now.
And just on that, one thing you said that was really fascinating about the what I think it's called docusoap or access reality, whatever you want to call it, but I suppose the stuff that cable networks you'll all be familiar with just have on, it appears 24/7, right? But they're very big shows, some of them, very big shows. And the fact they haven't, I think, broadly speaking, moved to network, I think that's probably true. I'm not sure there's been an example of one that's got... What do you think that's an interesting example. What does it need, do you think? For it
I think it needs for us to pick up a good one.
There you go. There's an answer. And if you've got a good one, pitch it. If you haven't, don't bother.
Yeah.
We're going to go to questions in a sec, but I just want to ask you a slightly more corporate thing, if you like. Which
right.
is,
are we being recorded here?
No. The tag at Edinburgh, David Abrams, Channel 4, was talking about the Americans coming over and taking over the plucky Brits and ruining everything. I don't know if that's a paraphrase. It was a bit more
I'm sure he'll be thrilled by that
description.
description.
More subtle than that. And you've got rumours of Disney buying Discovery, Consolidate, which you by all means comment on if you want, but I'm imagining you're not wanting to. So it's not about the detail, it's a more broad thing about where do you see the landscape going, this consolidation, this European US moving closer. Is that a pattern that continues, and where do you see it going? Well,
and you certainly see ITV buying a lot of companies in the US and beyond it, and I'm by no means an expert in the UK market. But here's where we come from. We have a number of different brands. Here we are in a building full of Disney imagery. And our Disney channels around the world are incredibly valuable. We've invested a lot in them. We've been here and around the world for some time. And we've not only invested a lot in those, we make a lot of shows. I mean, here and around the world, we make Evermore here and a lot of other shows. When it comes to ABC, we're far more we're scouting for talent. And it's one of the reasons we come on our own, because we don't really want the intermediaries, with due respect, of companies or agents. It's not until you get off the airplane and somebody says to you, boy, you have to watch House of Fools, or these are the 5 things you've got to watch. You cannot replace that. And we're scouting on all fronts. We're looking for talent behind the scenes. We're looking for talent in front. We're looking for formats that we think are interesting. We're looking for executives that we think are interesting. And we keep our eyes and our ears open all the time to do that. But from a wider sense, Disney has a number of very key brands. And it always looks to make sure that whatever it does is enhancing those brands. My boss, Bob Iger, has done a supreme job of, if you think when he first got into the job, it was really the Walt Disney Company. And nobody thought of ABC or ESPN as a brand. But we really are clearly a brand now. In fact, we're the #1 television brand in America. But he's then added to that, the Pixar brand, the Marvel brand, and now the Lucasfilm brand. And so the way Disney looks at it is incredibly through that prism of brands. and it's been a very successful strategy for him.
Thank you, Paul. So look, I think we've got 5 minutes. Lisa, I'm looking at you to confirm. Yeah, 5 minutes to take questions. So someone's already gone for it. Good for you. You may.
Hi.
Yeah.
Two quick ones. Lisa mentioned briefly your background as a BBC News reporter. Wondered if there's anything that you either taken from those days that you can use in ABC, or any similarities between shot at in Ulster and being in Hollywood. And then also as to whether British producers, or you said you're looking for formats and executives, or I know you've remade a few things in the States, but what is it that you're necessarily looking for in terms of British television?
Well, the answer to the first one, I was only very briefly a reporter. Thanks for mentioning that. Although I did meet my wife out there, so it was probably the most important moment of my life. But it was, look, I took one look, and I was very briefly following the big war correspondence around Belfast and the Troubles, and decided I did not want to be a war correspondent. So that's not something I went back to. But there's no question that the BBC was a fantastic training ground, because they took you around radio and they put you. I spent some time in music and arts and documentaries and other places, and it continues to be an extraordinary place to learn, not just the craft, but how to make the highest quality stuff that you can make. And in the end, it's all storytelling. The heart of BBC is about news and truth. That's the sort of high priests there. The high priests at Disney are about storytelling and magic, and we tell stories on this network, so that kind of fits me particularly well. But in terms of what we look for here, we're looking for something different. We're looking for people that break out. It's an incredibly dynamic market. It's an incredibly creative market. Something about England, during our lifetimes, I don't know if this was true, when our empire was more powerful, but something about the collapse of empires made Brits irreverent, brilliant, free-thinking, and it's something that we relish. We relish the notion, by the way, that's setting aside the genius of so many of the actors. And we have a lot of British actors on our network. I mean, from Ewan Griffith, you can ask Kelly as we go through it. Hayley Atwell's about to start in the network, Robert Carlyle. I could go through 10 of them. And here's the interesting thing. I don't think if Hugh Laurie were now cast again in House, that he would be given an American accent. In other words, I may be wrong about that. I was at school with Hugh, and his American accent was superb, but not at school, but on House. But the ability for us now to bring in talent openly is actually a huge advantage for us, because it's very, very difficult to put on a faultless accent and still have the sort of superb performances that he puts on. Robert is fascinating on Once Upon a Time, because half of the time he's putting on an English accent, half the time he's putting on an American accent. I'm like, where's the Scottish accent? Although when he goes on our panels, nobody can understand him. So I'm like, not that much of the Scottish accent so much, yeah. But we look for talent, we look for ideas, we look for things that sizzle, we look for risk-taking. And this is a very risk-taking market. That's what we love about England.
Great. Question there? Yes.
Here in the UK, we've had a few events in the past few years, like Lost finale being simulcast on Sky One, Breaking Bad and played the next day on Netflix. Do you feel there's more pressure from the global environment, or is ABC still primarily an American-based, American-focused company in their productions?
Certainly we make a number of productions around the world. We make a Turkish version of Revenge, and somehow something about Turkey is deeply connected to the word revenge. I don't know, but it's a big hit out there. Don't quote me on that. And we make Desperate Housewives around the world. We certainly love making local versions of shows, and will continue to do so. It's equally true, though, that we are not looking for shows. This is not quite your question, but when we try to make shows that are cast in order to sell around the world, they turn into what, certainly when I lived here, was called a Euro pudding. We're far better to do Revenge, do it in the Hamptons, do it brilliantly, and sell it around the world. And so many people will respond to that, and it will resonate with an audience. So we don't look to do that. That being said, it's always fun. I remember when we launched Body of Proof in Europe before we did in the US. Simulcasts are a really interesting idea. We love to get a global audience interested. It's very interesting to see how global audiences respond to our shows. We were just in Nashville. We do the CMAs, the Country Music Awards, and 45% of the tourism that is driven to Tennessee comes from people who watch the show Nashville. We're like, okay, well, we'll take a cut of that. But it's wonderful to see the impact of these shows on audiences, and we're not ashamed of their Americanness. It certainly sells and is watched avidly around the world.
There's a question, yeah.
I want to take you back to Blackish,
Yeah.
which is a really interesting show. But I wondered whether its success, whether you thought its success was down to the fact that there's been a cultural shift in America when people were, kind of letting out a sigh of relief that Last TV was reflecting that, or whether it just had, is it just so funny that it cuts across people's preconceptions? And also, when you talk about the Americanness of the show, what do you think about the idea of remaking Luther with American accents? And why don't we have Idris Elba? Why can't he be a US star with an English accent?
I think he can, is my answer to that. I'm not going to throw rocks at my friends over at Fox, but the answer to that is I totally think he can. In terms of Blackish, look, you never know. I mean, we can do as much sociological studies as you can, and you can try and pick up as much as you can from the zeitgeist of a country that's around you. But in the end, you're lucky if something catches. And I think you have put your finger on it. There is something about that conversation that people really want to have, and it's shades, right? It's called Blackish. It's shades of interpretation that are so fascinating about that. And it's different generations interpreting race in different ways. But here's the truth. If that wasn't a well-told story that resonated beyond the African-American community, it wouldn't be a hit. So part of it is they've taken a very specific story and they've made it resonate. Part of it is I do think we lent into race in a way that people on television have tended to lean away from it. And that was a little shocking. And there were a number of people who thought that we shouldn't call it Blackish. But the reality is it helped it. But I don't think it's a hit because of that. I think it's a hit because it's brilliantly done. I think it's a hit because the acting is superb. The kids on it are just adorable. I don't know if you've seen the other episodes. It gets better and better and better. Tracy's fantastic. Anthony's great. I think it works because it's a great show. That's really what drives it.
And we've got time for one more question, and it appears to be you, so
thanks.
Go for it.
I wish you all the best with Fresh Off the Boat. I'm really looking forward to hopefully getting my eyes on it. What do you think happened with Selfie, and how would you encourage British TV stations to be bold in being more diverse, because at the moment they're not very?
Yeah, I don't think it's my job to sort of encourage people over here as to what they should or shouldn't do. I mean, I can just say that with us, diverse voices behind the screen and diverse voices and diverse faces in front of the screen has actually brought in a bigger audience, and it's unleashed a whole load of creativity. So it's been, and just in terms of creating great television and connecting with an audience, it has been a very successful thing to do, and that's what we're in the business of doing. I certainly can't give advice over here because I don't come enough. What was the second part of your question? Selfie. Yeah, Selfie's a really good show. We were in a difficult slot there because we were up against The Voice. And I think the name Selfie, I blame myself for not renaming that. I think we did a very good job of saying Blackish is a great name. We can really imbue that with a lot of value and interest. I think with Selfie, we probably should have said early on, this is a word that our audiences, associate, not just with millennials, but with the narcissism of the social world and don't want to be associated with. And I'll take some blame for not renaming that show, but it was a very good show. The showrunner, Emily Kapnick, who did Suburgatory for us, is a supremely strong voice. I love her, and we would certainly work with her again.
Head of a broadcaster taking some blame is an interesting concept for us. We're just trying to get our heads around that, Paul.
I told you I'm not an American.
Brilliant. Look, thanks so much, Paul. It's been fascinating. I'm sure everyone agrees. And you have given, this comes from the very top. There are people at the back who literally cannot escape now, who are waiting for you to pitch a network with them. But for now, a huge thanks to Paul for being here tonight, and a round of applause.